What happens when the people who gave you life make it painfully clear that you are always last? That every ounce of love, every gesture of care is reserved not for you, but for someone else? Imagine sitting across from your parents, the sun cutting harsh lines across the living room floor, the air thick with unspoken truths, and hearing words that feel like knives. Your sister's family comes first. You're always last. The words didn't just hit me, they exploded, igniting a storm I could no longer contain. Every heartbeat thundered in my chest. Every breath felt trapped. And yet, I forced myself into a calmness I barely recognized. Good to know, I said, the words deliberate, almost too small for the weight they carried. But inside, fire raged. Friends and viewers, before we go further, make sure to subscribe to Roots of Revenge, hit that like button, and comment below, because this isn't just a story. This is a confrontation that will stay with you, a narrative of betrayal, favoritism, and the quiet fury of being overlooked. I remember my mother's face perfectly, smug, satisfied, yet hiding a flicker of unease. My father, usually the rock of authority, fidgeted, betraying the cracks in his composure. "We're just saying what's best," my mother insisted, her voice syrupy but sharp enough to sting. "Your sister has responsibilities. Her children, her husband, they come first. That's life." The room tilted. A nauseating realization washed over me. In their carefully constructed hierarchy, I was nothing. A shadow. A background character in a story that wasn't mine. "And me?" I asked, voice low but cutting, slicing through their practiced calm. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't wait. It presses down, suffocates, makes your heart ache. "Good to know," I repeated, a calm veneer masking the storm within. My sister, sitting a few feet away, pretended not to listen, but the subtle curl of her lips betrayed her satisfaction. She had always been the favorite, the golden child, the one whose needs overshadowed mine at every turn. In that moment, a dangerous awareness took root in me, a precise, calculated realization that I could no longer play the background. This was no longer a family squabble, it was a reckoning. Every slight, every overlooked achievement, every invisible moment in their eyes was accounted for, stored, ready to resurface. I imagined a cinematic lens capturing the room, the trembling hands, the clenched jaw, the controlled breathing, all framing the tension that had been simmering for years. "You think you understand priorities?" my father finally asked, attempting authority but faltering under his own guilt. "You're too young to comprehend the responsibilities we carry for your sister's family." His words, meant to dominate, fell flat. I leaned forward, letting the weight of my presence fill the room like a storm about to break. "Comprehend?" I echoed, each syllable sharp, deliberate. "I comprehend perfectly. I comprehend that in this house I am invisible unless I perform, unless I sacrifice, unless I mold myself into what you approve of. I understand that my existence is a footnote in your story, not a chapter." The words weren't anger, they were revelation, raw, undeniable truth. The room held its breath. My mother's hands tightened on the edge of her chair. My father's jaw moved, but no words followed. Silence became a mirror, reflecting the cold truth we all could no longer avoid. My sister, sensing the shift, tried to interject, but I raised a hand, halting her mid-sentence. "No," I said softly, the calm cutting deeper than a scream. "This is about truth, not excuses, not favoritism, not your version of what's best. This is about reality. And the reality is clear. I am always last. Good to know." The shift in the room was palpable. My sister's confidence wavered for the first time. My mother's lips quivered as she fought to maintain composure. My father's eyes, usually so controlled, betrayed guilt, fear, a recognition that their carefully maintained hierarchy had been challenged. This was no longer a conversation. It was a battlefield. Every word a weapon, every pause a potential mine. I could feel the weight of every ignored birthday, every unseen achievement, Every unnoticed sacrifice condensed into this moment. I was done being invisible, done being second. I leaned back slightly, letting the storm inside me simmer, knowing it had already changed the dynamic. I could see it in their eyes, the realization that I was no longer content to be a background character. And as the tension stretched, I felt a strange sense of clarity, a dangerous thrill. This confrontation was only the beginning. Outside, life continued as usual, but inside, everything had shifted. A storm had been unleashed, subtle but inevitable. And in that storm, I was no longer a victim. I was a force, quiet but undeniable, preparing for the reckoning that would follow. As the room stilled, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The room remained heavy long after my words hung in the air, a silence so thick it felt like it could crush us all. I could hear the faint tick of the clock on the wall, each second marking the slow crawl of a storm that had just begun. My sister, who had always thrived on control, now sat rigid, her carefully curated calm unraveling at the edges. She looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and something darker, fear, perhaps, of the force she had underestimated for so long. My parents, meanwhile, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. My mother's eyes darted nervously, searching for a lifeline, a way to reclaim the narrative. My father's jaw tightened, and I could see the subtle quiver of guilt he tried to hide. The air was electric, charged with anticipation, every heartbeat a drum in this theater of unspoken grievances. I didn't move immediately. I let them stew in the moment, let the weight of their words and my response settle like sediment in water. The calm before the storm is always the deadliest, I reminded myself, and this was my moment. Finally, I rose from my chair, slow, deliberate, letting the floor creak beneath my weight as if punctuating every unspoken insult and every dismissed achievement. "You've always made it clear where I stand," I said, my voice low, steady, each syllable heavy with meaning. Invisible, secondary, last, and now I understand perfectly. But do you think silence will keep me in my place? My sister's lips parted, perhaps to retort, but I held up a hand, stopping her before a single word escaped. "No interruptions," I continued, pacing the room slowly, letting my presence dominate the space. "Every holiday you ignored me, every birthday overshadowed by someone else's celebration, every accomplishment I achieved quietly, while the world cheered for someone else. It's all come together now, hasn't it? The pattern, the favoritism, the hierarchy you've built at my expense. I see it, I understand it, and I will no longer accept it." My parents flinched at the sharpness in my tone, at the calm fury that had replaced my usual restraint. They had believed their words would pass unnoticed, that I would nod, apologize, or retreat into the background. But I wasn't the same child they had raised. The quiet rebellion they had ignored for years had finally found its voice. My sister finally spoke, her words trembling, a thin veneer of authority failing to hide her panic. "You don't understand. We're trying to do what's best. You're overreacting. This is all about priorities." I stopped in my tracks, letting her words linger like smoke before igniting the next wave of truth. "Priorities?" I repeated, voice sharper, echoing through the room. "You speak of priorities, yet all my life I've been last, always the last to matter. You've never prioritized me. And now you want to lecture me about priorities? That ends here." My words hit the walls, reverberating with the tension that had been building for years. I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the uncertainty creeping into her once unshakable composure. My mother's hands trembled slightly, and my father finally spoke, attempting authority but faltering under the weight of the reality I laid bare. "We're doing what's necessary, for the family. You can't understand responsibilities." I laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor, tinged with bitter irony. "Responsibilities?" I said, pacing again, letting the room shrink around the intensity of my confession. "My entire life has been a series of sacrifices, of silences, of being overlooked so someone else could shine. And now You want to talk to me about responsibilities? No, I understand responsibility, and I understand neglect, and I will no longer tolerate the latter. I could feel the shift in the room, subtle but undeniable. The unspoken hierarchy had been challenged, and for the first time, they saw the consequences of their favoritism. My sister's fingers twitched nervously on the armrest of her chair. My mother's lips pressed tight together, and my father's gaze flickered between anger and regret. I realized then that the battle wasn't just about words. It was about power, perception, control, and the unacknowledged wounds that had festered for years. Every glance, every twitch, every hesitation was a crack in the carefully constructed facade they had maintained for decades. You think this ends here? I said, stopping in front of my sister, letting the tension stretch like a taut wire. You think I will go back to being invisible, quiet, and secondary? That I'll accept being last forever? No, that ends today. The room felt like it was vibrating with the intensity of unspoken conflicts. Every memory, every slight, every injustice laid bare in that moment. My sister opened her mouth to respond, but the words failed her. The once powerful, confident figure was now uncertain, stripped of the armor she had worn so carefully. I turned to my parents, my voice softening slightly, The air in the house had grown thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the eruption that was coming. I could feel the tension pulsing through every inch of the room, the flicker of my sister's eyes, the trembling of my mother's hands, the rigid stance of my father, as though each of them were preparing for a storm that had been years in the making. It wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a battlefield, a stage where every unspoken slight, every overlooked moment, every fragment of my invisible life was about to be laid bare. My voice, calm yet burning with controlled fury, cut through the silence. You think you can bury the truth beneath smiles, polite words, and celebrations that never included me, but truth has a way of surfacing, and I am not the child who will stay silent anymore. My sister's face twisted, a mix of anger, disbelief, and that fragile fear that I had seen only once before, years ago when something precious to her had slipped from her grasp. "You're overreacting! You're making this bigger than it is!" she said, her voice shaking, betraying the mask of superiority she always wore. I stepped closer, closing the gap between us, letting the heat of my presence press against her, the energy of the confrontation undeniable. "Overreacting?" I echoed, voice low but sharp enough to sting. Overreacting is when a child accepts invisibility for decades. Overreacting is when you let someone else's life, achievements, and happiness always take precedence over yours. I have done nothing but live in the shadow of your favoritism, and now it ends, today. My parents tried to interject, their voices overlapping, a chaotic chorus of justification and denial. "We're only doing what's best," my mother pleaded. "You don't understand responsibility," my father barked, each word carrying an authority that had once silenced me. But now their words fell like hollow echoes in an empty chamber. I had grown beyond their control, beyond their manipulations. I raised a hand, stopping them mid-sentence, my gaze cutting through their attempts at dominance. "Enough," I said, my calmness ablaze. "I understand exactly what you've done and why, and I understand that it has a cost. You cannot fix this with excuses or explanations anymore. This is about accountability, and accountability is overdue." A tense silence filled the room. My sister's chest heaved, her once commanding presence diminished, as though the carefully constructed armor of her confidence had cracked under the weight of my words. My mother's eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed, a mixture of guilt and disbelief frozen on her face. My father's jaw tightened, his pride and authority crumbling quietly, a man unmasked for the first time in front of me. The quiet was deafening. The only sound was the soft, almost imperceptible hum of life outside, oblivious to the emotional war waging within these walls. And in that moment, I felt a surge of clarity, a recognition that the confrontation was no longer just about the past. It was about the next moves, about strategy, about power reclaimed from those who had thought they held it forever. I paced the room slowly, letting the weight of my words settle like smoke, curling into every corner of the house, leaving traces of what had been unleashed. You've spent years deciding who matters, who doesn't. You've made it clear, without fail, that I am always last, that I am not worthy of attention, of love, of recognition, and now you see the consequences of that choice? My sister's voice broke as she tried again, her confidence crumbling further. This isn't fair. We're just trying to protect the family. I stopped, staring directly at her, letting the truth sink like a stone. Fair? I said, my tone cold and unrelenting. Fair is when everyone matters. Fair is when love is not conditional. You've had every advantage, every privilege, every hand extended in your direction, while I've been relegated to the sidelines. And now, the balance is shifting. You will no longer hold the power over my life. The game has changed. The first cracks in their defenses were visible, small but undeniable. My mother's hands shook, betraying the facade of composure she clung to. My father's shoulders slumped, the weight of decades of favoritism, neglect, and misplaced pride pressing down on him. And my sister's once steady gaze faltered completely, replaced by uncertainty, fear, and a flicker of respect that only comes when someone realizes they have underestimated you. I felt the subtle satisfaction of justice, not yet complete, but inevitable, coursing through me. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, I revealed the cards I had kept hidden, the memories, the evidence of my overlooked existence. Photographs tucked away, messages ignored, moments of silence where my achievements were celebrated quietly by friends, but never acknowledged at home. Look at this, I said, letting tea. The aftermath hit like a tidal wave, sweeping through the house, the neighborhood, and soon, the world beyond these walls. My words, my revelations, my refusal to stay invisible had fractured the delicate facade my family had maintained for decades. My sister, once untouchable, now sat frozen in the living room, her carefully constructed confidence replaced with a raw, unsteady vulnerability. My parents avoided each other's gaze, trapped between guilt, regret, and the dawning realization that their carefully curated hierarchy had been dismantled before their eyes. The air was thick with tension, a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on every corner, every wall, every memory in the house. And through it all, I remained standing, calm, resolute, a storm that had finally arrived. Outside, the ripple effect was already beginning. Friends who had long witnessed the subtle injustices, the favoritism, the quiet overshadowing of my life began reaching out. Messages poured in, concern, support, disbelief, and admiration. "We saw it coming," one friend wrote. "You've always been the strong one. Finally, everyone knows." Even distant relatives, previously oblivious or complicit in the hierarchy, began to ask questions, to seek the truth that had long been suppressed. And slowly, the private confrontation began to transform into a public reckoning, one where the invisible voice was now impossible to ignore. Social media, always a silent observer, began to stir. Subtle hints, photographs, and stories shared by friends painted the scene, each post a brushstroke in a rapidly forming portrait of truth. Inside the house, the tension remained unbearable. My sister, pale and unsteady, finally spoke, her voice barely audible, trembling between anger and disbelief. You've changed everything," she whispered, almost to herself. I nodded slowly, my gaze unwavering. "Yes," I said, calm but firm. "Everything changes when the overlooked decides to speak. Everything shifts when the last refuses to remain last. The world will know, the family will see, and nothing will ever be the same." My mother's lips trembled, an almost inaudible gasp escaping, as if she were finally beginning to grasp the depth of the consequences. My father's fists clenched and unclenched, a quiet struggle between pride, fear, and the realization that control had slipped from his grasp. The next days were a storm of emotions, whispers, and revelations. Extended family members called, some in anger, some in fear, others in quiet support. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, the subtle shifts in perception amplifying every word, every action from that day of confrontation. My sister, who had long manipulated social appearances to maintain her untouchable image, found herself suddenly exposed, her confidence rattled by the undeniable truth of my words and the evidence I had laid bare. Each social interaction became a minefield, each glance a reflection of a truth that could no longer be denied. My parents, too, were forced into reflection, their attempts at justification crumbling in the face of consequences that extended beyond the walls of our home. And yet, amid the chaos, there was clarity. I realized that the confrontation had served a dual purpose. It had not only revealed the truth, but had also empowered me in ways I had never experienced before. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer last. And the world, friends, family, neighbors, social observers, had witnessed it. Every whispered conversation, every uncertain glance, every message of support or challenge reinforced a fundamental truth. Once a voice rises that has been silenced for too long, it cannot be ignored. Then came the public responses, subtle at first, but quickly escalating. Messages circulated online, videos of similar confrontations shared, discussions sparked about family dynamics, favoritism, and the invisible scars left on children forced to live in the shadows. Some sympathized, some criticized, some questioned, but none could deny the power of a confrontation rooted in truth. The storm I had unleashed was no longer contained within our walls. It was social, emotional, viral. And with each passing day, the balance continued to shift, favoring honesty, courage, and the refusal to accept invisibility. Inside the house, tension gradually transformed into reflection. My sister, humbled and uncertain, began to ask questions, not about dominance or favoritism, but about recognition, fairness, and accountability. My mother and father, still struggling with guilt, began to confront their choices in ways they had never allowed themselves to before. And I, having spoken the words I had carried for years, felt a strange mix of exhaustion, triumph, and clarity. The confrontation had been exhausting, raw, and brutally honest, but it had worked. Power dynamics had shifted, voices had been heard, and consequences were no longer theoretical. The world outside continued to observe, comment, and